This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. It's War, Peace, and the Presidency. I'm Amy Goodman. We continue our look at Republican vice presidential nominee JD Vance with a new piece headlined "The 7 Thinkers and Groups That Have Shaped JD Vance's Unusual Worldview." It was written by our next guest, Politico reporter Ian Ward, who's joining us from New York. He spent a few months with Vance this year for a profile about his first year in the Senate and his broader vision for the Republican Party, in a piece that was headlined as "There's Something More Radical Than MAGA." JD Vance is dreaming it. Ian Ward, welcome back to Democracy Now! We had you on during the Republican convention when we were in Milwaukee. Now these comments have surfaced that Vance doesn't disavow from 2021 in an interview where he attacked Kamala Harris, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Pete Buttigieg, calling them cat ladies, childless cat ladies. Can you talk about where does his views come from? Who are the people who influenced him most?
Vance comes out of a conservative intellectual ecosystem that's very concerned with this question of child rearing, family policy, and in particular the declining birth rate in the United States. I mean, currently the birth rate is around 1.7 children per family, which is below the replacement rate, what they call the replacement rate. You know, if 2 people have 1.7 children, the population in theory won't propagate itself. You know, and many of these people on the populist nationalist right see that as an enormous sort of civilizational existential challenge, right? That's not just a technocratic issue. That's an issue of whether society can propagate itself into the future, right? The converse of that is they're looking at ways to raise the birth rate through public policy. One of their primary influences in that respect is Viktor Orban's government in Hungary. Orban's government has adopted a very sweeping set of what they call pro-family policies. These are tax subsidies for families with children, block grants for newly wedded families to buy houses, a whole range of things. And there's actually a fairly robust interchange between conservative intellectuals in America and pro-family advocates in Hungary, looking at ways to raise the birth rate.
So why don't you begin, as you profile these 7 thinkers, start with, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, Patrick Denine?
Yeah, Patrick Denine, he's a philosopher, a professor of political theory at the University of Notre Dame. He himself is a Catholic. He's become known as sort of the figurehead for a group of thinkers who call themselves post-liberals. You know, they believe, Denine wrote a book back in 2018 arguing that liberalism, small L liberalism, as a sort of system of political philosophy had actually undermined itself, that the expansion of individual rights and the expansion of a free market economy had undercut the collective bases of American life, you know, family, religion, and sort of any sort of communitarian, communal ethos. In a more recent book published in 2023 called Regime Change, Denine argued for a kind of what he calls a peaceful revolution to replace the liberal order with a post-liberal order. You know, the difference being a liberal order would is primarily directed towards the protection of individual rights and liberties, a post-liberal order, which is grounded in a sort of Catholic worldview and Catholic social teaching, though Denine doesn't say that explicitly, so an important caveat. But the post-liberal order is directed towards, you know, the preservation and proliferation of the kind of conservative values and religious values. Denine's very close with Vance. Vance actually attended the book launch for this book, Regime Change, back in 2023. And Vance has said explicitly that he's a member of the post-liberal right and that he views his role in Congress as anti-regime. So he's closely tied in with this world that Denine represents. And
Vance himself converted to Catholicism in 2019. His wife is Hindu. Who's Brad Wilcox, the University of Virginia professor who wrote Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization?
Yeah, he calls himself a pro-family intellectual. Again, a conservative religious guy. You know, the broader intellectual context here is this is a group of people who are questioning whether what liberals call progress is actually good for society, and also whether the past sort of 60 years of social change dating back to the 1960s has actually been a good thing. Vance doesn't think it has been. He comes from this world that thinks sort of the sexual revolution was a mistake or has had terrible unintended consequences, that the women's entrance into the workforce has not been the sort of boon for feminism that liberals make it out to be. He had this tweet, and he used this line in a couple of speeches, that's like, if your worldview tells you that's bad for women to become mothers, but liberating for them to work 90 weeks in a cubicle at the New York Times or Goldman Sachs, you've been had. This is part of his broader critique that the culture war is class war, that liberals have weaponized social views to consolidate and advance their own economic interests. So the idea that it's liberating this is his conception, the idea that it's liberating for women to enter the workforce ultimately redounds to the benefit of companies who can benefit from more and cheaper labor, as opposed to benefiting the women who find some sort of fulfillment or liberation in the work.
Let's talk again about Peter Thiel. I mean, when you talk about the great influences in Vance's life, his former venture capital boss, primary funder of his 2022 Senate campaign, gave something like $10 million, where his philosophy fits in here.
Yeah, Thiel, if I'm being honest, Thiel is not spoken. I mean, Thiel's wrapped up in this idea that the society can't propagate itself if the birth rate is low. But Thiel's influence on Vance is primarily thinking about, one, the relationship between democracy and freedom, and second, thinking about the role that technology plays in society. Thiel is a sort of techno-libertarian, which occasionally verges into kind of techno-authoritarianism, but who thinks that technology holds the potential to be completely revolutionary, but has been perverted by various economic incentives and the poor leadership of liberal elites, right, to become a thing that shackles us and prevents us from building a better society, as opposed to liberating us and building a better society. His famous slogan is that we wanted flying cars when we got 140 characters, meaning we thought technology could change the world, and instead we turned it into things like Twitter and Instagram, which make us anxious, unhappy, and more open to economic exploitation by companies than ever before. He's also said he doesn't think that freedom and democracy are compatible anymore. Vance has not endorsed that view specifically, but that's sort of Thiel's political philosophy in one line.
And talk about Curtis Yarvin.
Yeah, Yarvin, I should begin this with a caveat, which is many of the thinkers I mentioned in the piece, Vance is actually in regular contact with. He talks to people like Patrick Denine. He talks to Peter Thiel. He's called Yarvin a friend. I assume they talk, but I think Yarvin is a bit more distance from some of these thinkers, from Vance and some of these other thinkers. But Yarvin is a blogger. He's a former computer programmer. He came to internet fame in the early aughts, blogging under the pseudonym Mensch's Moldbug, and he articulated this worldview that he calls neo-reactionary. NRX is often how it's abbreviated. He's sort of often cited as the house philosopher of the new right, which is the world that Vance comes out of intellectually. Yeah, he's a monarchist, straight up. I mean, that's how he would describe himself. He thinks that American democracy has sort of denigrated into a corrupt oligarchy, and that the way to resolve this oligarchic tendency is to install a dictator, that's the term he's used, a kind of national CEO who would run the country like the CEO of a startup would run a startup. Vance has not endorsed in public this whole project. He has cited Yarvin's work in connection with his belief that second Trump administrations should fire a significant number of civil servants and replace those people with people who are ideologically aligned with himself and with Trump. But yeah, this is another guy that Vance is clearly breeding and engaging with.
What about Renee Gerard?
Yeah, Renee Gerard is a French-born philosopher, literary critic. He was, in fact, one of Thiel's mentors at Stanford University when Thiel was a student there. So Gerard was introduced to Vance by Thiel. Gerard's ideas are incredibly complicated, so I won't do them the indignity of trying to summarize them very shortly. But one idea that Vance has cited in connection with his own conversion to Catholicism is what Gerard calls the scapegoat mechanism, which is the idea that in societies, people compete over a limited set of goods, and they often want the same things, which creates social conflict, which is ultimately resolved by identifying a member of that community who somehow wronged the community. You then scapegoat them, often by killing them, and then that leads to sort of social equilibrium. This changed, Gerard thinks, with the advent of Christianity, because for the first time, a society scapegoated someone who was very clearly not guilty of any crime against the community. This was Jesus Christ. And so by killing someone who was obviously innocent, the Christian narrative shows that the problem is not with the scapegoat, the problem is with ourselves, and this leads to the whole Christian theology. But Vance has said he's identified with the story and found it profound and helped him, identify some of his own spiritual hangups. So he cited that narrative in particular as a way of explaining his own conversion to Catholicism. And
talking about conversion to Catholicism, Sohrab Ahmari, we just have a minute.
Yeah, Ahmari is the co-editor of a magazine called Compact, which began as a kind of union between the populist right and the populist left. He's an advocate of pro-worker conservatism, what he calls pro-worker conservatism, which again, Sohrab is a Catholic convert. This is the kind of idea of the conservative right inflected by Catholic social teaching and the doctrines of the Catholic Church.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. People can read your articles. You talk about the Claremont Institute and other influences on JD Vance, who you profiled. Ian Ward is a Politico reporter. The new piece, The 7 Thinkers and Groups That Have Shaped JD Vance's Unusual Worldview. And his recent piece, Is There Something More Radical Than MAGA? JD Vance is Dreaming It.